They said I should rot. Imagine that. Your own daughter leaning across a metal table in a visitation room so cold it felt refrigerated, her voice low enough that the guard couldn't hear, her eyes bright enough that I knew she meant every syllable. Rot in prison, you deserve it. Those were her exact words, and I remember wondering, absurdly, whether she had rehearsed them in the car on the way over, whether she had tested different tones in the bathroom mirror, searching for the one that would land deepest. People think cruelty is spontaneous, but I've learned that the sharpest wounds come from sentences spoken calmly, with a steady jaw, as though the cruelty has been folded carefully into the speaker's breath long before the moment it's released. I didn't respond to her. I just sat there with my hands flat on the table, the skin thin and mapped with new veins, trying to understand how a child I had once rocked against my chest, humming lullabies I barely remember now, had become a woman who looked at me like I was something she found under a shoe. And the strange thing was, I wasn't even angry at that moment. Shock is a kind of shelter. It wraps you in cotton, dulls the edges, makes everything feel like a distant radio broadcast in a language you used to speak fluently but no longer recognize. I was 78 then, and tired in the way only age can tire you. Not just in the bones or the joints, but in the secret places. The places where you store all the moments you forgave without receiving forgiveness back. All the nights you stayed. Awake comforting a crying child. All the times you held your breath so someone you loved could exhale. Prison taught me many things, but even before that, life had already been educating me in silent, unglamorous ways. The day my daughter said those words, I had already spent 2 months behind bars, eating food so flavorless it felt like punishment by itself, sleeping on a mattress thinner than a prayer, listening to women cry in the dark and pretend in the morning that they hadn't. I didn't cry, though, not because I was brave. I am not brave, but because shock had built a small room inside my chest and locked me inside it. And in that small room, there was no space for tears, only questions that didn't yet have the strength to be asked aloud. When I looked at her across that table, she didn't look like the girl I remembered, the one who used to fall asleep with her head heavy on my shoulder, the one whose forehead always felt warm under my palm. She looked like someone carved from ambition and resentment, someone so determined to rise above her origins that she needed those origins, meaning me, to disappear. She wore a fitted coat, navy, expensive looking, the kind with clean seams and a collar that stood up as if backed by its own arrogance. Her nails were painted a glossy, pale color, the kind that women choose when they want to look polished without appearing to try too hard. Everything about her felt sculpted, deliberate, distant. Even the way she sat, legs crossed, hands folded neatly on her lap, posture impeccable, as though the very air around her belonged to her alone. I recognized none of it. Or maybe I recognized too much and simply didn't want to admit that the hints had always been there, scattered over the years like breadcrumbs I'd swept aside, convincing myself that all children grow sharp edges as they age, and mothers must learn to dull themselves so those edges don't cut too deep. I had been told that morning that she was coming to visit, and for a brief foolish moment, a ridiculous, hopeful part of me believed she was there to tell me she'd found the mistake, that she knew I hadn't done what they said I did. I thought perhaps she had remembered who I was before wrinkles carved themselves into my neck, who I had been when she was small and frightened, and I stood between her and every shadow. But that illusion dissolved the moment she opened her mouth. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask whether I was eating or sleeping, or if the bruises on my wrists were healing. She didn't even sit down right away. She stood there for a beat, examining me like she was assessing the damage to an antique she accidentally dropped, and was now deciding whether it was worth repairing. And then she sat, exhaled, and delivered the sentence that split my life into before and after. I suppose I should tell you that I live alone now, in a modest retirement home, where the halls smell faintly of soap and oatmeal and old papers. My room is small, but sunlight finds its way into it each morning, as though it has memorized the path by heart. I have a window that looks out onto a courtyard where one elderly man feeds pigeons with crumbs he always claims he doesn't have, and I sit there most afternoons, wrapped in a shawl knitted decades ago by hands I can no longer remember distinctly, but I know they were warm. I sip weak tea, the kind I once would have complained about, and I listen to the quiet hum of other people breathing down the corridor. I have grown comfortable with silence in a way I never expected, almost protective of it. Silence after what I lived through feels like a second skin I never want to shed. But that day in the visitation room, her face, her voice, the coldness, those things visit me at night when the lights are dim and the nurses walk slowly past my door. They float up like unwanted memories often do, thick and stubborn, refusing to be swallowed. I replay her words sometimes, not because I enjoy the pain, but because part of me still tries to understand the exact moment when I ceased to be her mother and became her enemy, her obstacle, her burden, her pawn. People think villainy is loud, operatic, dripping with malice, but cruelty from a loved one is quieter, almost polite. A simple sentence spoken in a room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights that buzz like flies. And yet it carves deeper than any knife. I remember thinking, as she stared at me with those unblinking eyes, that she looked almost relieved, like finally she had said the thing she had been wanting to say for years. And I realized, with a kind of aching clarity, that perhaps this wasn't her transformation. Perhaps this was her revelation. Perhaps she had always been this cold, and I had been too willing to wrap her in warmth to notice. So yes, that is how my story begins, with a daughter who looked at me as though I were something to dispose of, and a mother who sat frozen, wondering how love could turn into something so sharp without making a sound. And though life has moved on, though I am free now and she is not, those first words still echo through me, not as a wound, but as a reminder that betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face you once kissed goodnight. They tell you that an arrest happens quickly, that it slams into your life like a storm breaking a window, all noise and shattering and bright chaos. But mine unfolded with a terrible, almost polite slowness, as if the universe wanted to give me enough time to understand every detail of the betrayal before it carried me away. I remember the morning clearly because it felt so ordinary, almost painfully so. The kettle humming on the stove, the light falling across the kitchen table in long stripes, the faint smell of lemon from the cleaning spray I always used too. Generously, I had just settled into my chair with the newspaper when the knock came, soft at first, like someone unsure whether they were welcome. I expected a neighbor, maybe a delivery driver with the wrong address, but when I opened the door, there were 2 officers standing there, uncomfortable in that way people get when they know they're about to break something fragile. They addressed me by my full name, the formal version no one had used since my wedding day, and asked if I was alone. The question seemed strange, unnecessary, intrusive, but I nodded, and that was all they needed to step inside. Their voices were cordial, even respectful, and they explained the situation with the same tone a doctor uses when trying to soften a diagnosis. There had been a report filed. There was documented evidence. My signature appeared on withdrawal forms and transfer requests for large sums of money taken from my daughter's account. They said the numbers like they were reading off a grocery list: 12,000, 29,000, 43,000, each amount heavier than the last, each one stacking on top of my bewilderment until I could barely breathe. I thought at first it had to be a mistake, a mix-up of documents or identities, something that would be clarified with a single phone call, a quick explanation from the only person who had access to that account other than me. I reached for my phone, but one of the officers gently placed his hand over mine and said it would be better to keep things orderly. "You will have a chance to speak," he added, as though I were some reckless creature likely to lash out. I told them I didn't understand. I told them I rarely touched my daughter's finances except when she asked for help organizing receipts or arranging bills after her husband traveled. I told them that our arrangement had always been based on trust, that she had given me permission, that I had never withdrawn anything for myself. They listened patiently, and for a brief moment I saw something human in one officer's eyes, maybe sympathy, maybe doubt. But duty overrides kindness, and within minutes they were reading me my rights in my own living room while the tea cooled and the sun shifted across the floor like nothing unusual was happening. When they led me outside, I saw my daughter standing at the end of the walkway, her arms folded, her posture stiff, her face expressionless. She didn't rush to me. She didn't even pretend to be shocked. She simply watched, letting the officers escort me past the rose bushes I had planted 20 years ago, the ones she never watered because she didn't like the smell. I remember calling her name, not loudly, just enough for her to hear, but she didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't soften. Instead, she turned slightly toward the officer beside her and asked whether she needed to be present for the formal statement later. Her tone was practical, almost businesslike, as though she were confirming the pickup time for dry cleaning rather than overseeing the arrest of her own mother. She didn't look at me again, not even when I stumbled on the last step, and one of the officers steadied me with a gentle grip. At the station, they placed the documents in front of me, page after page of transactions I had never made, dates that didn't align with my routines, and signatures that resembled mine, only the way a shadow resembles a real object, similar enough to fool someone who isn't looking closely, but unmistakably wrong if you know your own hand. My daughter had always been good with paperwork, meticulous with details, talented at imitating handwriting from her years taking art classes where she practiced calligraphy for fun. I had praised her then, admired the grace of her letters, never imagining those skills would one day be sharpened into blades pointed at me. I tried to explain. I told them I had been in the hospital the week one of those transfers occurred. I told them I hadn't used my email at all the month another authorization had supposedly been sent. I told them that if they looked closely, they would see discrepancies, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. But people in uniforms often trust ink more than trembling elderly voices, and the system moves with a momentum that doesn't pause just because a mother is confused and frightened and desperately piecing together the first shape of a terrible truth. The worst moment wasn't the fingerprinting or the cold chair in the interrogation room, or even the realization that they didn't believe a word I said. The worst moment was when a young officer slid a single sheet of paper across the table, my daughter's formal statement. It was concise, polished, articulate in that tone she used when she wanted the world to know she was the sensible one, the stable one, the victim. She wrote that I had been increasingly forgetful, that I had a history of confusion with finances, that she had suspected unauthorized withdrawals and had only hesitated to report them out of deep concern for her mother's well-being. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, the kind of narrative that wraps itself around you before you realize it's tightening. But there was one line that echoed louder than the rest. I love my mother, but I cannot allow her to continue harming my family or herself." That sentence was a knife disguised as a plea for help, and I knew then, with a clarity that drained the last of my disbelief, that this was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, planned, executed with precision and emotional distance that chilled me more than any prison cell ever would. By the time they placed me in the holding room, the world felt tilted, as if gravity had shifted and nothing sat where it belonged. I sat on the metal bench and stared at my hands that had once braided her hair, tied her shoes, held her feverish body through childhood nights. And I tried to reconcile those memories with the accusation she had written so cleanly, so confidently. I wanted to imagine she had been coerced, manipulated, pressured by someone else. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. She had chosen this path. She had chosen to erase me on paper before erasing me in person. It wasn't until I heard the cell door close behind me, the sound final and metallic, that the catalyst completed its cruel work. Everything that followed, the trial, the sentence, the shame, was born in that moment when my daughter decided that my freedom was something she could trade away without blinking. And even now, years later, I sometimes hear the echo of that door closing whenever I close my eyes, a reminder that betrayal doesn't merely arrive. It constructs itself brick by brick until you find yourself locked inside something you never saw being built. If the arrest had been a breaking point, then the months that followed were a slow and deliberate sanding down of everything I had once believed about myself, the kind of erosion that doesn't happen with a single blow, but with 1,000 tiny abrasions, each one small enough to overlook but sharp enough to leave a mark. People imagine confinement as a series of dramatic confrontations, shouting matches, collapsing nerves, and tearful outbursts, but the truth is far more insidious. It is the daily quiet that undoes you, the way your world shrinks inch by inch until even your breath begins to feel like it belongs to someone else. My first weeks in prison were not filled with danger or violence, but with a strange, disorienting stillness, a sense of being placed on a shelf and left there like an object no one knew what to do with. I was assigned to a lower bunk in a cell that smelled faintly of bleach and old sweat, shared with a woman who had long since perfected the art of ignoring everything around her, including me. She didn't greet me, didn't ask my name, didn't glance in my direction, except to make sure I didn't touch her few belongings. It wasn't hostility. Hostility would have been easier to manage. It was something worse, indifference. In that world, indifference was the currency that determined your worth. If no one bothered to hate you, it meant you were insignificant. And insignificance, I would learn, was far more suffocating than fear. The guards didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their power was in the monotony. The same walk, the same tone, the same quick flick of the keys as they passed, the same casual glance that skimmed over me, like one might look at a stain on a floor. I began to feel as though the walls themselves were pressing inward, molding me into something smaller and smaller, until I barely recognized the shape of my own thoughts. Meals arrived on plastic trays with food so bland it tasted like punishment for a crime I hadn't committed. I forced myself to swallow it, not because I wanted to eat, but because not eating would have meant giving in to a despair that frightened me more than the confinement itself. The lawyer appointed to me visited only twice, each time with an expression that hovered between boredom and impatience, as though he had been interrupted from something infinitely more important. He told me that the evidence against me was unfortunate, that my daughter's testimony was compelling, and that the prosecution would almost certainly push for the maximum sentence unless I considered pleading guilty. "It will go easier on you," he said with the gentle condescension one uses with a difficult patient. easier, as though any of this could be measured along a scale from simple to unbearable. I realized quickly that he did not believe me, or perhaps he did not care enough to form a belief either way. I was just another case file, another aging defendant who had become inconvenient to her own family. Letters came, but not from my daughter. They came from institutions, the prison, notifying me of program assignments, the court, reminding me of deadlines for appeals, a church ministry, offering printed prayers that felt mass-produced, though I tried to read them anyway, hoping the words might lend some shape to the emptiness. I told myself to be patient, that eventually my daughter would write, that she would reconsider, that some flicker of guilt might crack through the armor she had built around herself. And I waited for that flicker with the same stubbornness that had carried me through motherhood, marriage, widowhood. Hope is a stubborn habit, especially for those of us who spent our lives believing that love, even when malformed, still had edges, soft enough not to cut completely. But no letter came, not a single one. 2 months passed before I received my first envelope with handwriting I recognized, and it wasn't hers. It was from my neighbor, a kind woman who used to bring me tomatoes from her garden. She wrote only a few lines, but those lines nearly undid me. Your daughter says she wants space. She says she's healing from what happened. Healing. As though I had wounded her by not committing the crime she invented. As though she needed to recover from the destruction she had orchestrated. I carried that letter back to my cell with trembling hands, folded it, unfolded it, read it until the words blurred into a single shapeless block of ink. Something inside me shifted that day, something subtle, yet irreversible. It was the first time I understood not just that she had lied, but that she had closed the door behind the lie and bolted it from the other side. I had been erased from her story, not with rage or passion, but with simple, methodical precision. And then came the smaller indignities, each one a thread in the tapestry of my humiliation. My cellmate began taking my portions of bread during meals, not with threats or aggression, but with a casual hand that expected no resistance. I let her, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I did not want to invest energy into fighting over carbohydrates when I was fighting for my sanity. During laundry rotation, someone took my assigned shirt and replaced it with one 2 sizes too large, stained in a way that suggested it had lived several lives before reaching me. I wore it anyway. It hung off my shoulders like a borrowed identity, but I no longer had the strength to object. As weeks melted into months, I noticed another kind of erosion. My memory of the outside world began to fade in soft, dissolving edges. I could no longer recall the exact color of my old bedroom walls or the texture of the couch where I used to sit reading. The rhythms of my life before incarceration blurred into something abstract, a distant dream that felt like it belonged to someone else. Even my daughter's childhood began to shift in my mind, not becoming false, but becoming fogged, as though someone had smeared fingerprints across the glass through which I saw her. I tried desperately to hold on to the images, her tiny hands clutching mine on the first day of school, the cracked sound of her laughter when she blew bubbles in the backyard, the way she used to lean against me when the world frightened her. These memories flickered like streetlights struggling to stay lit, and I clung to them because losing them felt like losing myself. There were nights when the silence was so complete it felt like an entity, pressing against my skin, crawling into my chest, whispering doubts I tried not to hear. Perhaps that was the worst part, not the accusations, not the legal battle, not even the betrayal from my own blood, but the slow internal unraveling that came from prolonged isolation. It made me question my own righteousness, made me wonder whether perhaps I had misremembered events, whether age had softened my clarity, whether my daughter's story made more sense to those who preferred simple narratives to complicated truths. I fought these thoughts, but they returned again and again, relentless, until I had to grip the edge of my bunk just to anchor myself in reality. Every so often, I would overhear the guards discussing upcoming cases, laughing about defendants who insisted on their innocence. "They all say that," one of them remarked one day, standing just outside my cell. "It's always someone else's fault." And though he wasn't speaking about me specifically, his words burrowed into my bones. I had become one of them, accused, dismissed, categorized, swallowed by a system that sorted people not by truth, but by paperwork. And my daughter had crafted that paperwork with surgical precision. So the first escalation wasn't an explosion, wasn't a sudden shift toward brutality. It was the quiet accumulation of small abandonments, each one a whisper telling me I was on my own. It was the dawning realization that the world outside continued without me, that the people I loved had not paused, that the house I once kept warm was now occupied by someone who had replaced me with a narrative that suited her ambitions. And inside those walls, I felt myself shrinking, not into weakness, but into a kind of sharp, condensed awareness. It would take time before that awareness blossomed into resolve. But even then, in those early months, I sensed the faintest beginnings of something growing in the cracks of my despair. Not hope. Hope was still too fragile, but a quiet refusal to disappear, a stubborn ember that insisted I would not be erased so easily, no matter how thoroughly my daughter had tried to do exactly that. I don't know the exact day when the fog inside me first began to thin, but I do remember the moment I understood I couldn't continue drifting through my own life, like a ghost waiting for permission to exist. It happened on a morning that seemed no different from the dozens before it, a gray, washed-out dawn when the corridors echoed with the same footsteps, the same keys, the same muffled orders. But something in me felt unsettled, restless in a way I hadn't felt since long before my arrest, as if a small internal hinge had loosened in the night. I woke up with the vague sense that I had forgotten something important, something essential, like a name or a promise, or the memory of someone I used to be. And all day that feeling tugged at me, like a thread trailing from my sleeve. After lunch, I wandered into the small prison library, a place I rarely visited, because the silence there always seemed heavier than in the cell blocks, too full of longing, too full of people staring at pages they weren't really reading. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a place to sit where the lights were warmer and the air didn't smell like disinfectant. I remember sliding a random paperback from the shelf simply because the spine wasn't cracked yet and the cover was clean. When I opened it, something fluttered out and landed at my feet. At first, I thought it was a bookmark, but when I picked it up, I saw that it was a printout of old court schedules, the kind clerks used before everything became digital. The page was dated, yellowing around the edges, and held together by a single rusted staple. Most people would have tossed it into the trash without a second glance, but my eyes stuck to one particular line, a date from 3 years earlier, marked with a handwritten note in blue ink. M. Harlow, medical leave verified. I froze. My breath snagged in my throat because that date, burned now permanently into my memory, matched one of the fraudulent withdrawal slips used against me. According to the bank statements that had been held up in court like sacred truth, I had walked into a branch and signed documents while I was lying in a hospital bed after a fall that left me unable to lift my own leg, let alone walk unaided. The defense had brushed off my protests then, saying memory lapses were common at my age, but here, accidentally tucked inside a forgotten book, was a scrap of proof that I had not misremembered anything. For the first time in months, I felt the sharp spark of certainty cut through the numbness that had wrapped around my mind. I don't know how long I sat there holding that page, staring at it as though it might vanish if I blinked. My hands trembled not from fear or age, but from the realization that the universe had handed me a thread, delicate but real, and all I had to do was pull. I folded the paper as gently as if it were something alive and slipped it into the waistband of my pants, beneath the elastic, close to my skin. I could feel it there the entire walk back to my cell, warming against my hip with every hesitant step I took. When the guards did their nightly inspection, I lay on my bunk, utterly still, terrified they might search me, even though they rarely bothered with women as quiet and unthreatening as me. But they moved on, uninterested, and only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. That night I didn't sleep. I watched the faint light filtering through the narrow window, listened to the muted coughs and restless turning of the women around me, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: clarity. Not hope exactly. Hope was still too ambitious a word for those early hours. What I felt was a quiet reawakening of my own mind, as though someone had opened a window in a sealed room and let in a sliver of air. I began going over everything I could remember about the case, recalling dates, signatures, people I had spoken to, mistakes that had felt too minor to mention at the time. My daughter had been careful, yes, but careful people often overlook the small, mundane details they consider beneath their intelligence. And I knew those details intimately because I had lived them. Over the next week, I returned to the library whenever our schedule allowed, pretending to browse for books while secretly searching for more discarded documents. I didn't find anything as clear as that first page, but I found patterns, old rosters, visitor logs, scheduling slips, all containing tiny discrepancies between dates and records that the prosecution had used against me. Little things like a stamp placed on the wrong line or an entry marked with initials that weren't mine. None of these individual pieces would have convinced anyone on their own, but together they formed a faint but undeniable outline of a truth my daughter had never expected anyone to question, least of all me. And with each piece I discovered, something inside me began to sharpen, like a blade being honed against stone. Word travels strangely in prison, moving in currents you don't always notice until they touch you. Women who had never acknowledged me before started giving me sidelong glances, whispering in corners, speculating among themselves about why I suddenly carried myself differently. I wasn't louder or braver, but I was no longer drifting, and that alone shifted the air around me. My cellmate, who had gone months without speaking a full sentence to me, finally lifted her eyes one morning and said, "Whatever it is you found, don't let it slip through your fingers. This place eats people who wait too long." It was the longest thing she had ever said to me, and I nodded, unable to speak through the sudden knot in my throat. I wrote letters that week, carefully, deliberately, in small measured handwriting that I had always reserved for important things. Not letters to my daughter. I had nothing left to say to her then. These were letters to legal aid clinics, to case review organizations, to anyone whose mission involved righting wrongs the system was too lazy or proud to revisit. I copied the dates from the paper I had found, referenced the hospitalization records I knew existed, and asked them, politely at first, then firmly, to reconsider what had been presented as fact. I didn't expect immediate miracles, but the act of writing itself became a declaration that I had not surrendered, that beneath the frail exterior was still a woman who understood how to trace truth through chaos. When the first reply came, thin and typed and cautious in tone, it said only that they would review my file. But those few words moved something tectonic inside me. It was the first response from the world beyond prison walls that wasn't dismissive, patronizing, or indifferent. I felt the shift not in my circumstances, but in myself. A woman who believes she is powerless behaves one way. A woman who discovers even a sliver of evidence in her favor moves differently, breathes differently, thinks differently. She becomes, in small and incremental ways, someone capable of pulling herself back into the light. In the days that followed, I found myself observing everything with a clarity I couldn't have summoned earlier. The guards' routines, the timing of mail distribution, the schedules posted in the hallway, the bureaucracy that underpinned every decision made about us. I no longer felt like a piece of driftwood tossed helplessly in someone else's current. I had grip again, a sense of direction, and though I knew the road ahead would be slow and uneven, I felt, for the first time since my daughter's betrayal, a quiet rising inside me, not fierce or dramatic, but steady, like the gradual strengthening of a heartbeat after a long illness. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel brave, but I felt awake. And for a woman who had been pushed into silence, that awakening was the beginning of everything that would follow. Pressure didn't arrive with a shout or a slammed door. It came dressed as progress, as a small official envelope that appeared in the afternoon mail cart with my inmate number written neatly on the front, as if the universe had decided to see whether I really meant what I'd started. By then, several months had passed since I found that forgotten schedule slip in the library book, months in which I had written and rewritten my story to strangers with law degrees, months in which I'd slowly grown used to carrying my certainty like a hidden stone in my pocket, something solid I could touch when the days dissolved into sameness. When I opened the envelope in my cell, my hands were steadier than they had been the last time I handled formal paper, and yet the words still stole my breath for a moment. They were reopening my case for review, not fully, not generously, but enough to warrant a hearing, enough to require that someone in a suit look again at the timeline my daughter had built so carefully. It was the smallest of victories, not even a crack in the wall yet, just a hairline fracture. But to a woman who had been told over and over that everything was settled, the phrase further examination read like a door left slightly ajar. It did not take long for the system, or perhaps fate, to answer that opening with its own kind of reaction. When word gets out that your case is being reconsidered, you stop being invisible, and visibility inside a prison is its own peculiar danger. Guards who had previously treated me like a piece of furniture now called me by my last name, with a new tone, part curiosity, part irritation, as if I had made extra work for them by refusing to go quietly into the drawer where old women with convictions are stored. Other inmates began watching me, not all at once, not directly, but in the sideways glances familiar to anyone who has ever lived in close quarters with people who have their own histories of pain and suspicion. Some offered me advice, some offered me warnings, and some offered me nothing at all, just that unreadable gaze of those who know that hope is an expensive commodity and are wary of anyone who seems to possess even a sliver of it. But the real escalation, the true test of whatever fragile strength I had begun to nurture, arrived with a name written on a clipboard outside the visitation room and a guard's casual statement that I had a family visitor that afternoon. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake, that they had confused me with someone else because no one from my family had stepped forward since the day my daughter watched them take me away. A neighbor had written. A distant cousin had sent a Christmas card the previous year with my address scribbled incorrectly, clearly forwarded by someone else. But no one close, no one whose name had once filled my home with meaning, had tried to bridge the distance. I followed the guard down the corridor, feeling as though my body were moving separately from my mind, my feet carrying me towards something I was not sure I wanted to see. She was already there when I walked into the visitation area, sitting perfectly upright in one of the molded plastic chairs, her handbag placed neatly at her feet, her coat draped across the back of the chair, like a carefully chosen prop. Time had not softened her, at least not in any way visible to the eye. If anything, she looked more polished, more composed, her hair pulled back in a low knot that must have taken effort to make look so effortless. She wore a blouse the color of bone and a delicate chain around her neck, and for a moment I had the absurd thought that I was underdressed, standing there in my institutional uniform, as though I had failed to meet the unspoken dress code for our confrontation. She didn't get up when I approached. She just watched me with that same appraising look I remembered from the day of my arrest, the one that made me feel less like a mother and more like an object being evaluated for potential flaws. "Sit down," she said quietly when I reached the table, and there was a command in her voice that might once have made me laugh, back when she was a toddler issuing orders with a plastic crown on her head. Now it landed differently, heavy and cold. I lowered myself into the chair and folded my hands in front of me, partly to steady them, partly to give myself something to do other than reach across the table and shake her, demand an explanation that I knew she would never willingly give. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two women with the same shape of chin and the same faint line between the eyebrows, separated by a gulf that paperwork alone could not explain. Then she spoke, not with the apology or hesitation some still soft part of me had once prayed for, but with a calculated calm that told me she had rehearsed this conversation as carefully as she had rehearsed her statement for the court. "I heard," she began, smoothing an invisible crease on the table, "that they're looking at your case again." She didn't sound angry or surprised or even particularly invested. She sounded inconvenienced, like someone whose carefully arranged weekend plans had been disrupted by a sudden rainstorm. I told her that yes, a review had been granted, that some questions had been raised about the timeline, about my hospital records, about signatures that no longer fit as neatly together as they had the first time around. My voice was calm, steady even, and hearing myself speak with that controlled tone, I realized that prison had handed me one unexpected gift. It had burned away whatever illusions I had left, leaving behind only the bones of who I was. And those bones were stronger than I'd realized. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to betray the first hint of tension under the poised exterior. "You need to stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This, whatever you're doing, it's not going to change anything. All it does is drag everything out and make you look more unstable." Unstable. The word sat between us like something sour, something rotten. I asked her what she was so afraid of if she was so certain of my guilt. Why a few questions about dates and documents should bother her if everything was as clear-cut as she claimed it was. I saw it then in her eyes, the flicker, that quick, betraying flash of fear she couldn't contain quickly enough. She covered it with annoyance almost immediately, but I had seen it. And once you see fear in someone who claims to be righteous, something fundamental shifts in the way you regard them. "This isn't about fear," she said, fixing me with a look that might have intimidated a less determined woman. "This is about reality. You're old, Mom. You're not well. Even if by some miracle they shaved a few years off your sentence, what would you do? Where would you go? You don't have a house anymore. You don't have savings. The best thing you can do is accept what happened, serve your time quietly, and stop making trouble. Every time you file a request, every time you push for another review, it drags my name back into it, my life, my family." The word family rang strangely coming from her lips, because in that moment I understood that when she said it, she did not mean us. She meant the life she had built without me, the version of herself that she presented to her. Neighbors, her colleagues, her children, I was no longer part of that definition. I was an old embarrassment she had tried to bury with legal forms and convincing testimony. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I hadn't stolen her money, that I hadn't forged her documents, that I hadn't done the things she insisted to the world I had done. I said it not in the pleading tone of a mother begging for belief, but in the clear voice of someone who has finally stopped trying to earn love from a person who uses it as leverage. She rolled her eyes, an adolescent gesture that looked grotesque on a grown woman. "You always do this," she said. "Twist things, make yourself the victim. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed going to the police and telling them my own mother was siphoning from my accounts? You forced my hand. You were careless. You were slipping, and you wouldn't listen. So I had to protect what's mine." There it was, that possessive edge, that emphasis on what belonged to her, as if everything in her orbit, including me, were property to be managed. The guard nearby shifted his weight, casting a quick glance in our direction, but he didn't intervene. Our voices were still low, measured, the conversation more chilling for its lack of overt drama. She lowered her tone further, leaning in so close I could smell her perfume, expensive and floral, cloying in the sterile air. "If you keep pushing this," she said, "if you try to drag me into another hearing, I will make sure they see exactly what you are. A confused old woman who can't accept reality. I will tell them about your episodes, your forgetfulness. I'll bring in every doctor, every neighbor, every distant relative who ever thought you were odd, and I'll have them all testify that you're not stable. You think anyone is going to take your word over mine?" She said it with such icy confidence that I had to remind myself to breathe. Her cruelty was not a sudden eruption of anger. It was a calculated strategy, honed over years of practicing how to position herself as the reasonable one in every conflict. For a second, I almost faltered. I thought of the judges and attorneys, the administrators and committees, all those faceless bodies who might find it easier to accept the narrative she offered. A frail, confused mother rewriting history out of shame, rather than do the hard work of re-examining a verdict already recorded. But then another thought pushed through, quiet but insistent. They had already agreed to look again. Someone, somewhere, had found enough inconsistency in the original case to justify reopening it. The ground beneath her certainty was not as solid as she wanted me to believe. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the stiffness in them, the ache that reminded me I was not young, but also not yet a ghost. "You can say whatever you like," I murmured, not in defiance, but in a kind of tired clarity. "You've already taken my freedom, my reputation, my place in my own life. If you need to take my dignity in front of strangers to keep your story intact, then that's between you and whatever you see when you look in the mirror. But I won't help you anymore. I won't agree. I won't sign. I won't confess to something I didn't do, just so your world stays neat and polished." For the first time since she sat down, the mask slipped more than a fraction. Her jaw tightened, the muscle ticking just beneath her ear. She opened her mouth as if to reply, then closed it again, standing abruptly as the guard called time on the visit. As she walked away, she paused at the door and turned back, delivering the line that would echo through my next sleepless nights. "If you won't protect me," she said softly, "then don't expect me to protect you when this all falls apart. Rot in here if you want. You made your choice." And then she left, the door shutting behind her with a soft, final click that felt more brutal than any slam. In the weeks that followed, The pressure she had promised materialized in subtler ways. A new psychologist requested to speak with me, citing concerns raised by external parties about my emotional stability. She asked questions about my memory, my moods, my sleep. She probed gently but persistently about whether I ever felt confused about dates, whether I ever had trouble distinguishing dreams from reality, whether I had a history of misinterpretations with family members. I understood the script because I had once helped my own mother through an evaluation when her mind began to slip. The difference was that my mother had been forgetting names, places, entire days, while I was being asked to doubt the one thing I knew, more clearly than anything else, that my daughter had orchestrated my fall. I answered calmly, carefully, aware that every word could be used to frame me as unreliable. I described my daily routine, my habits, the precise sequence of events leading up to my arrest, and I watched the psychologist's eyes as she took notes, searching for any sign of predetermined judgment. There was some skepticism there, yes, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even an awareness that not every elderly defendant fits neatly into the box labeled confused and harmless. Around the same time, I heard through whispered conversations that my name had appeared in a small local newspaper, not with my own words, of course, but in a quote from my daughter. She had given an interview about elder financial abuse, positioning herself as an advocate for victims, forced to hold loved ones accountable. It's heartbreaking when the person who raised you becomes someone you no longer recognize, she was quoted as saying, but silence only protects the abuser. Those words reached me secondhand, filtered through the bitter amusement of another inmate whose cousin worked in the prison's clerical office and had seen the clipping. When she relayed the quote, I felt something inside me twist, not with fresh pain, but with a recognition that my daughter was already preparing the world to see me as unstable, as dangerous in that quiet way people become when their minds go. It was a preemptive strike against any narrative I might someday have the chance to present. Instead of breaking me, however, that knowledge solidified my resolve. If I let her define me in courtrooms, in newspapers, in casual conversations over wine and dinner with people who would nod sympathetically and marvel at her strength, then I would be doing the final work of my own erasure for her. I could not control what she said out there, but I could control whether I agreed with it in here. I could control whether I signed papers that twisted the truth. I could control whether I sat back and waited for time to run over me like a slow, heavy train, or whether I reached for every document, every oversight, every old piece of paper that might prove I still knew my own life better than anyone else did. So the pressure grew, yes. The visits from professionals became more frequent. The implication that it would be easier on everyone if I accepted a compromise was dangled in front of me like a key attached to a poisoned string. My daughter's threats lingered like perfume after she left the room, cloying and hard to wash off. But alongside that pressure, something else was growing just as steadily. My refusal to participate in my own silencing. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, steady thing, like a plant pushing its way through cracked concrete, slow but relentless, unconcerned with whether anyone believed in its right to exist. There comes a moment in every long humiliation when the soul refuses to bend any further, when the body, worn and softened by age, finds a steel inside itself that youth never needed. For me, that moment did not come with fanfare or revelation. It arrived quietly, the way dawn arrives in winter, too pale at first to notice, then suddenly illuminating everything with a cold clarity that leaves no shadows to hide in. It was early spring when the letter arrived. Tucked among the stack of notices and routine papers, the guard pushed through the bars with a sigh, as though he were delivering the same meaningless words day after day. The envelope looked no different from the others, but the weight of it felt strange when I lifted it, not heavier but denser, like something inside had been compressed by truth. When I opened it, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the faint electricity of long-awaited inevitability, for inside was the acknowledgement that the review board had accepted new evidence into my file, including the hospital verification records and the timeline inconsistencies that someone somewhere had finally bothered to examine with an unclouded mind. It was not an exoneration yet, not freedom, not even a promise, but it was a validation of what I had known all along. The story my daughter had constructed was no longer airtight. In the days that followed, the air around me seemed to shift, the guard's stares becoming sharper, more appraising, as if trying to reassess a woman they had once dismissed as an aging thief. Other inmates, always alert to changes in tone and hierarchy, began treating me with a curious mix of caution and respect, because nothing inside those walls is more unsettling than someone the system thought finished, who suddenly stands again with purpose. But it wasn't the growing attention that steeled my resolve. It was a realization, deep and resonant, that even if the world remained indifferent, I could no longer afford to be. I had spent too many years allowing the tide of circumstance to push me, first in the name of love, then survival, then inertia. But now that movement reversed, not with anger, but with a quiet, deliberate insistence that my life would not end as a footnote in my daughter's carefully curated version of events. The day of the hearing was unremarkable in weather and in the rhythm of the prison, but inside me it felt like a tide turning. They brought me into the courtroom in shackles, though they were unnecessary, a theatrical gesture meant to remind everyone present of who the state believed me to be. I held my head steady, not out of pride, but because lowering it would have been a betrayal of every night I lay awake, piecing together the fragments of truth. The prosecutor, a younger man with the polished indifference of someone who considered my case beneath his ambition, shuffled papers with the air of a person irritated at having to revisit what he thought was settled business. My court-appointed lawyer, replaced only weeks earlier at my request, met my eye with a nod so slight it could have been imagined, but it steadied me nonetheless. And then, as though scripted by a playwright with a cruel sense of irony, my daughter entered. She walked with the same confident stride she had worn the day she watched them lead me away, her expression composed, her clothing immaculate, her gaze fixed forward as though I were merely a piece of old furniture left in her peripheral vision. She sat in the witness area, her jaw set, and for a moment I felt something tender and foolish flicker inside me, a longing for the child she once was, the child I had carried, protected, soothed. But then she folded her hands in her lap with that practiced grace, and whatever softness had stirred in me dissolved. The hearing began with facts presented cleanly, almost clinically, dates of hospitalization, signature analyses, log entries, inconsistencies in bank authorizations that no longer aligned with the timeline she had sworn to under oath. My lawyer presented them with calm assurance, letting the documents speak. There was something profoundly liberating in watching the pieces fall, not by force, but by weight. The truth had its own gravity. I watched the prosecutor's posture stiffen slightly, watched the judge's expression shift from bored to attentive. Even my daughter's perfectly controlled breathing faltered for a fraction of a moment, so brief that no one else might have noticed. But mothers are trained by nature to detect the smallest tremor in their children. When they called her to speak, She rose with a dignity that would have fooled any stranger, and for a moment she performed exactly as I expected. Measured answers, unwavering certainty, the ease of a woman who had rehearsed every possible question. But documents are not as pliable as emotions, and the questions asked by the review board were not designed to accommodate her narrative. When they pointed out the dates that did not match her claims, she explained them with irritation, disguised as confusion. When they presented the verification that I was immobile in a hospital bed when one of the withdrawals occurred, she said perhaps she misremembered, that the timeline felt blurry, that she had been under stress. And when they showed her the forged signature overlays, hers and the imitation of mine, there was something unmistakable in the way her gaze flicked down and then away, something that rippled in the courtroom like a small but undeniable breeze. The moment of climax did not explode. It distilled. It came when they asked her why. If she believed me so untrustworthy and dangerous, she had waited nearly 6 months before reporting the supposed theft. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But whatever answer she offered was incoherent, stitched together with panic rather than logic. In that instant, the courtroom shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough that I felt it in my bones. They no longer saw me as a confused elderly woman, and they no longer saw her as the flawless victim. The imbalance she had relied on, the cultural bias toward the articulate adult daughter over the aging mother, tilted. The judge paused the proceedings to review the evidence privately, and when he returned, the sentence that followed was not dramatic, not emotional, but devastating in its simplicity. My conviction was vacated. I was to be released pending further investigation, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, was to be held for questioning under suspicion of fraud, perjury, and financial exploitation. I felt neither triumph nor vindication in that moment, only a vast, aching quiet that seemed to settle on my shoulders like a shawl woven from equal parts relief and sorrow. As they uncuffed me, I watched her face, searching for any trace of the girl I had raised, any plea, any recognition that what was unfolding wasn't an act of revenge, but the natural consequence of truth rising through the cracks she had tried to seal. But she only stared at me with a kind of stunned disbelief, as if she could not understand how her story, so carefully crafted, so diligently defended, had unraveled in a single afternoon. The mask she wore was gone, replaced by a naked, trembling fury that told me she had never believed I would fight back, never imagined that the mother she had silenced would reclaim even a fraction of her own voice. Freedom was not a triumphant walk into the sunlit world. It was signing papers with shaking hands, stepping outside into air that felt warmer than I remembered, and realizing that the price of truth was the final collapse of whatever fragile bond had remained between us. But as I stood there, the sky stretching wide above me, I knew that this was the irreversible moment, the act that divided my life into the before and the after. I had not sought revenge. I had sought recognition, and in claiming it, I had reclaimed myself. Freedom arrives quietly when you are older, not with the dizzy sweetness people imagine, but with a strange, echoing calm, as though the world has been holding its breath for too long, and finally exhales around you. After they released me, there was no family waiting on the other side of the gate, no warm arms, no voices calling my name. There was only open air and the shuffle of my shoes on gravel as I stepped forward, unfamiliar with the weight of movement without supervision. A volunteer from a re-entry program handed me a coat that smelled faintly of lavender, clean but secondhand, and offered me a ride to a temporary shelter. I thanked her and accepted, because pride is a luxury that makes no sense when you are 78 and have spent 3 years sleeping beneath flickering lights. As we drove through the city, everything looked sharper than I remembered, as if my eyes had forgotten how to filter light, and every color, the brick of buildings, the green of street signs, the deep blue of passing cars, felt almost intrusive in its vividness. The shelter was quiet, cleaner than I expected, and the women who ran it gave me space without pity. I slept there for 2 nights, long hours of dreamless rest that felt like borrowed time. On the 3rd morning, a social worker with a gentle voice took me to the retirement home where I live now, a modest place with pale corridors and residents who move slowly through their days with the resigned grace of people who have made peace with the narrowing of their worlds. My room is small, but sunlight touches it faithfully each afternoon, and someone has placed a pot of basil on the windowsill, already sprouting shy green leaves that lean toward the warmth. I don't know who planted it, maybe a volunteer, maybe the nurse with the round glasses who always smells faintly of chamomile. But the sight of it growing so confidently in a place meant for endings stirred something soft inside me. In those first days, I found myself listening for footsteps that weren't there, for the clang of metal doors, for the curt voices of guards calling schedules, but eventually the echoes faded, replaced by the murmur of televisions behind half-open doors, and the distant laughter of a staff member whose joy always seems slightly too loud for these hallways. I spend my mornings writing in a notebook they gave me, not to record everything that happened. I lived it once, and that is enough, but to anchor myself in the present, to remind myself that time still moves forward, even when it feels as if you have stepped outside its currents. Some afternoons I sit by the window and watch the gardener trim the hedges, his movements slow and deliberate, and I am struck by how much gentler the world looks when you are no longer trying to survive it. My daughter has not written. I did not expect her to. When the sentence came, 25 years, a number as heavy as stone, the newspapers made a small noise of the case, focusing on the cruelty of financial exploitation, on the irony of roles reversed, on the tidy narrative of a daughter corrupted by ambition. But I read none of it. Someone showed me one of the articles clipped from a local paper, and I folded it without looking, because I have no room left in my chest for stories told by strangers. The truth is simple. She made her choices, and I made mine. And the space between those choices has become a kind of quiet terrain I no longer feel obligated to cross. Sometimes people ask me whether I hate her, whether I feel vindicated, whether the verdict brought closure. The answer to all of it is no. Hate requires energy, and I spent too many years pouring my strength into trying to be believed. Vindication is a word better suited to courtroom dramas than to elderly women who spend their days watering herbs. Enclosure is a fantasy for those who want life to behave neatly. What I feel instead is a calm acceptance, not of what she did, but of what remains. The past sits behind me like an old piece of furniture, solid, unmovable, carrying its weight but no longer dictating where I stand. In the evenings, when the corridor lights dim and the building settles into its nightly rhythm, I make myself tea and sit at the edge of the bed, letting the quiet pool around me. I think of the women still inside, those whose names I never learned, but whose presence softened my hardest nights. I think of the neighbor who wrote to me when no one else did. I think, cautiously, of the daughter I once knew, the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and tangled hair, long before the world hardened her into someone I could no longer reach. And though that memory aches, it also warms me, because no matter what she became, there was a time when she loved me without condition. I hold on to that, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as a truth that belonged to a time untouched by betrayal. I do not pretend that everything is healed. Healing is not the right word for what has happened. It suggests a return to what once was, and there is no path back to those early chapters. But I have found something steadier than healing, something like peace, but quieter, less triumphant, more honest, a peace that sits with me rather than lifting me, a peace that understands pain without needing to erase it. If another woman were sitting here beside me, someone whose life has been cracked open by the people she trusted most, I would take her hand and tell her this: you may feel broken, but you are not finished. You may feel abandoned, but you are still here. You may have been cast aside, but you are not disposable. Some people will fail you in ways you never imagined possible, but their failures do not define your worth, and their choices do not dictate your ending. You do not need their apologies to reclaim yourself. You need only the quiet courage to keep moving, one step at a time, toward the life that still waits for you. And if your path leads you to a small room with a window and a pot of basil growing stubbornly toward the sun, let that be enough for now. Let the light touch you gently. Let yourself breathe again. You have survived the storm. Now allow yourself to live in the calm.